The bell above the diner's door chimed softly as Jim Carter stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and sizzling bacon filling the air. It was his usual spot, a small corner booth at the back, tucked away from the buzz of the busy morning crowd. He'd been coming here for years, ever since he moved back to the small town after retiring from the military. The faces were familiar, though the staff had changed over the years. A few of the old regulars still came by, a couple of locals who never seemed to age, and the steady hum of conversation filled the diner. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. Jim wasn't looking for anything special, just a meal, a place to clear his head. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the small town. But Jim's eyes were heavy, weighed down by memories and time. He'd earned his place at the counter, earned his seat at this diner. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention, didn't need the spotlight or applause. He was quiet, he was reserved, and his military jacket, worn, faded, spoke for itself. It carried the weight of years spent on the front lines, though he didn't like to mention it. The jacket had seen too much. He had seen too much. As he settled into his seat, the waitress behind the counter flashed him a tired smile. Emma, the new cashier, didn't seem to recognize him at first. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with soft features and a nervous energy that only young people could manage. She wiped her hands on her apron and approached him, pen in hand. "What can I get for you today, sir?" Her voice was friendly, but there was an unspoken distance, an unspoken assumption that came with the polite routine of waitressing. Jim glanced at her for a moment, noting how her eyes flickered down to his jacket before glancing back up at him. He wasn't surprised. People did that. They saw the military insignia, made their assumptions, and moved on. He didn't mind. "I'll take the usual," Jim said quietly, his gravelly voice blending into the hum of the diner. "Burger, fries, and coffee." She nodded quickly, scribbling it down on her notepad. But then something unexpected happened. She hesitated. She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze softening, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she turned away, heading back toward the kitchen. Jim didn't give it a second thought. He'd been coming here long enough to know how the routine worked. The place was busy today. Lunch rush had just ended, and a few customers lingered. Jim could hear snippets of conversation from the regulars, their voices drifting in and out like background noise. The TV in the corner was muted, showing the weather forecast. He didn't need to look at it. He knew what to expect. The town never changed. But as he sat there, trying to clear his head, he noticed a group of young people walk in. They were loud, laughing, almost too full of themselves. They made their way to a table near the window, talking animatedly as if the whole world revolved around them. Jim couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation, a mix of empty chatter and exaggerated stories of their college days. One of the guys in the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with messy hair and a cocky grin, spotted Jim sitting alone at the counter. "Look at this guy," the man muttered to his friends, loud enough for Jim to hear. "Some kind of hero, huh? With the jacket and everything. Probably just comes in here to get some free food or sympathy from everyone." His friends laughed, the sound carrying across the diner. Jim didn't flinch. He'd heard worse, much worse, in places far darker than this. But the young man's words stung nonetheless. The casual disrespect, the assumption that a man like Jim was just some relic from the past, just a story to be laughed at, mocked, and forgotten. Jim clenched his jaw but didn't say anything. He wasn't the type to stir the pot, not anymore. The years in the military had taught him a certain kind of restraint, but it didn't mean it didn't hurt. The old wounds, the memories, no amount of time could ever truly heal them. The waitress, Emma, returned to the counter with his meal, setting the plate down in front of him. She gave him a smile, this time a little more genuine, and Jim nodded his thanks. But just as he was about to reach for his coffee, Emma seemed to pause, noticing the young man at the nearby table. He hadn't stopped staring at Jim, his smirk widening as he made a comment to his friends, barely keeping his voice down. Emma turned to Jim, her face softening. She hesitated again, looking between him and the group, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. The smirk on the young man's face faltered as Emma suddenly spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, I'm afraid your meal's on the house today," she said, her gaze never leaving the young man who had been mocking Jim. Jim blinked, caught off guard by her words. He looked up at Emma, unsure of how to respond. The group of young people, who had been so loud moments ago, fell silent. They stared at Emma, then at Jim, their faces turning from smug amusement to confusion. The silence in the diner was deafening for a moment, until the young man with the cocky grin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What do you mean?" Jim asked quietly, still trying to make sense of the situation. Emma gave him a small smile, a nod of respect. It's on me. You've earned it." The young man at the table shifted, now clearly uncomfortable. The rest of the diner seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Jim looked down at his meal, the fries still steaming, his coffee untouched. The last thing he expected was this. "Are you sure?" Jim asked, still unsure, his voice gruff as he reached for his wallet. Emma didn't budge. "Yes, I'm sure. You've earned more than a meal. I just think you deserve a little respect." The moment hung in the air, thick and heavy. Jim's fingers hovered over his wallet, still unsure of what to make of Emma's words. She stood there, calm and steady, her gaze unwavering as she waited for his response. The young man who had been mocking him earlier shifted in his seat, his cocky grin replaced by an uncomfortable expression. The table of friends, once filled with laughter and loud chatter, was now silent, their eyes darting from Jim to Emma, unsure of how to react. For a moment, Jim didn't move. He had never been one to seek attention, to be the center of anything. His life had been a quiet one, a life spent in service, in doing what was asked of him without question. He never expected to be acknowledged for it. He never asked for the praise or recognition. He had always believed that the real reward was in the work itself, in the sacrifice, in the doing. But Emma's gesture, this sudden, unexpected act of kindness, was different. It wasn't just about the meal or the free food. It was about respect. It was about someone seeing him, truly seeing him for what he had done, not just for the jacket he wore or the stories he carried. It wasn't something he was used to. It was the kind of respect he had long forgotten existed, buried under the weight of his own memories and the world's indifference. He looked up at her, his face unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice gruff, a little unsure. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of anything, and certainly not like this. Emma just shook her head, her voice steady. "I want to. You've earned it, sir. You don't have to explain anything." She stepped back, giving him space to make his decision, but her eyes never left his. The sincerity in her voice was something that cut through all the years of distance Jim had put between himself and the world. The group of young people at the table was now whispering among themselves, their earlier arrogance fading into something more like awkwardness. One of the girls at the table shot a quick glance at Jim, then back at Emma, but there was no defiance in her gaze, only hesitation. The power of Emma's gesture wasn't lost on them. Jim could feel his heart beating a little faster, a small rush of something unfamiliar rising within him. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something else. Something he hadn't felt in years. The world had always seemed like a place where he didn't belong anymore, a place that had moved on without him, without understanding what it had cost him. He had kept his distance, avoided the noise, not wanted to be a burden. But here, in this small, quiet diner, with the smells of home-cooked food filling the air, something was different. "All right," Jim said finally, his voice softer now, the weight of the moment sinking in. "If you insist." Emma smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It wasn't about sympathy or pity. It was respect. And in that moment, Jim realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't invisible. Maybe he wasn't just a soldier who had been forgotten by time. Maybe there was still a place for him in this world, a world that had moved forward, but one that still carried pieces of the past with it. The young man who had been mocking him, Kyle, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He cleared his throat and avoided Jim's gaze, his earlier bravado fading. Jim could feel the tension at the table, the awkwardness, the realization that they had crossed a line they hadn't understood. It wasn't just the free meal, it was the gesture that came with it, the acknowledgement of Jim's worth, the recognition that, no matter how much time had passed, there was always something to respect about those who had served. Kyle's voice was quiet when he spoke, almost apologetic. "Look, I didn't mean it like that," he said, shifting in his seat. The words felt awkward, like they didn't quite fit, but they hung in the air, an attempt to make amends. Jim didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The words weren't necessary. The acknowledgement was already there, unspoken. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting Kyle's for a moment, and that was enough. He didn't need an apology. He had heard enough of them over the years to know that some words didn't mean anything without the actions to back them up. The rest of the diners, too, seemed to settle back into their meals. The hum of conversation slowly started up again, but it was different now. Quieter, more reflective. The small gesture from Emma had done something. It had shifted the atmosphere in the room, turned it into something less about judgment and more about understanding. It wasn't just the free meal. It was the recognition of what it meant to give someone the space to be who they were without needing to explain, without needing to justify their place in the world. As Jim finished his meal, he noticed the group of young people exchanging glances, talking in hushed voices. It wasn't the usual brashness that he'd grown used to, but something quieter, more thoughtful. Kyle looked at Jim again, his eyes no longer filled with mockery, but with something else, something that resembled respect, perhaps even a little shame for the way he had acted. When Jim stood to leave, the young man didn't make a joke, didn't try to lighten the mood with sarcasm. Instead, he met Jim's eyes again, this time with sincerity. "Take care, sir," Kyle said, his voice low but genuine. Jim simply nodded, his eyes softening slightly. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about understanding. And as he walked out the door of the diner and into the crisp air of the evening, Jim realized something. Maybe, just maybe, this world wasn't as cold and indifferent as it had seemed. Maybe there was still room for respect, still room for the things that truly mattered. Jim stepped out of the diner, the cool evening air hitting his face like a refreshing breeze. It was quiet now, the distant hum of the town barely reaching his ears. The lights from the diner's sign cast a soft glow across the parking lot, but it felt peaceful, almost surreal compared to the tension that had simmered inside moments ago. As he walked toward his car, he found himself lost in thought, the weight of the past few moments settling in. The simple kindness from Emma had done something he hadn't expected. It had sparked a shift in the atmosphere, in the very air around him. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, not just someone passing through. In that diner, he had been seen for the first time in a long while. And it wasn't just about the meal, it was about being recognized. It was about the small yet profound act of respect. He reached his car and paused, his hand on the door handle. The silence of the parking lot felt different now, more welcoming, as if the world around him had opened up just a little bit. Jim wasn't sure what it all meant. He wasn't sure what had changed inside him. Maybe it was simply the realization that he wasn't alone, that the past didn't have to weigh him down forever. Or maybe it was just a moment in time, something fleeting and small that would fade as quickly as it had come. But whatever it was, it had struck a chord deep inside him. The door to the diner creaked open behind him, and Jim turned instinctively, his hand still on the door. Emma stood there, looking at him, her expression more thoughtful than before. She hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of whether to speak or not. Finally, she took a step forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes meeting his with quiet sincerity. "I know you didn't come in here expecting any special treatment, but I think what you did for us today, just by sitting there, by being who you are, it meant something to all of us." Jim felt his throat tighten, though he couldn't quite place the emotion that stirred inside him. It wasn't pride, nor was it embarrassment. It was something different, something deeper. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough. "You didn't have to do what you did. I wasn't looking for anything." She smiled softly, stepping a little closer. Sometimes, people don't realize how much the small things can mean, especially when someone's been through what you've been through. You don't always have to ask for respect. Sometimes, it's just about giving it to others, even when they don't expect it. Jim nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had lived a life of service, a life of sacrifices that he had never fully shared with others. But in that moment, in the quiet understanding between them, something shifted. He wasn't just a soldier from the past anymore. He was a man, a person, with a history and a story that had been ignored for far too long. But here, in this small diner, he had been seen. He opened the door to his car, the night air now feeling a little less cold. "I appreciate it, Emma," he said, his voice steady but carrying an emotion that he couldn't fully name. "And I'll be back soon. I think I'll be back." She nodded, stepping back toward the diner with a small smile. "I'll look forward to it. Take care, Mr. Carter." As Jim got into his car and started the engine, he glanced back at the diner through the rear-view mirror. The lights inside were still on, casting a warm glow over the windows. He didn't know why it felt so important, but somehow, in that moment, he realized that it wasn't just about the meal or the free coffee. It was about the way he had been treated, the respect he had been shown when he least expected it. It had meant more than he could explain, more than any words could convey. The road ahead was long and dark, but for the first time in a long while, Jim didn't feel quite so alone on it. It wasn't that the world had changed, it was that he had started to change. He had begun to see himself differently, not as a soldier clinging to the past, but as a man who had earned his place, even in a world that had long moved on. And in that quiet diner, with the gentle kindness of a stranger, Jim had started to understand that sometimes the smallest gestures, simple acts of respect, could carry the greatest weight. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He drove through the streets, the familiar road home, now feeling a little less burdensome. And as he turned onto his street, he knew something had shifted inside him. Maybe it was just a small moment, a brief encounter, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that even after all these years, he wasn't invisible. And that was all he needed to move forward. The next few days passed in a blur, but something had shifted in Jim. The routine, the quiet existence he had grown accustomed to, no longer felt like it was enough. It wasn't that he was dissatisfied, not exactly. It was just that something had been stirred inside him, something he hadn't known he was missing. He found himself thinking about the diner, about Emma's words, about the way she had seen him when he least expected it. He had walked in that morning expecting nothing more than a meal, but he had walked out with something far more valuable, something that had been lacking in his life for years: recognition. Not just for his service, but for him as a person. That recognition was a strange thing. He hadn't realized how much he had craved it until it was given to him so unexpectedly. For so many years, he had kept his head down, silently living with the weight of his past, not wanting to burden anyone with it. But Emma had made him see that it wasn't a burden to share. It was a part of who he was, and that was enough. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. On a whim, Jim decided to return to the diner the next morning. As he walked inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, and he was greeted by the warm, familiar smell of coffee brewing and sizzling bacon. The usual bustle of the morning crowd filled the air. The regulars were there, but it was Emma who caught his eye immediately. She was behind the counter, busy taking orders, but when she noticed him, she broke into a smile, her eyes bright with recognition. "Good to see you again, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice light and welcoming. Jim smiled, a rare, genuine smile that seemed to come easier now. He had always been a man of few words, but with her there was something different. He didn't need to explain himself. Emma understood. He took his usual seat at the counter, and she immediately made her way over, already pulling out a mug. "Coffee?" He nodded, settling into the familiar rhythm of the diner. "Yeah, and the usual, please." Emma went to work, efficiently preparing his meal, while chatting with him in a way that felt effortless, as though their conversation was a continuation of something that had started long before. Jim didn't feel the need to explain himself. He simply enjoyed the simplicity of the moment. The diner was a small world, and for the first time in a long while, Jim felt like he belonged in it. As the meal was set down in front of him, Jim glanced around at the other customers, some of them eating in quiet conversation, others lost in their own worlds. His eyes wandered to the table where the young group had sat the last time he was here. The table was empty now, the chairs still tucked neatly beneath it. For a moment, Jim felt a pang of discomfort, the memory of the mockery lingering in the back of his mind. But then, he looked back at Emma, who was still smiling at him from behind the counter, and the discomfort faded. He realized that, in this small town, it was the people who mattered most. People who respected each other, even when they didn't fully understand. The door swung open again, and a man in his mid-30s stepped inside. Jim noticed him immediately. He was tall, with a broad frame, and carried himself with an air of authority that immediately caught Jim's attention. As the man walked past, he caught sight of Jim sitting at the counter. His eyes narrowed, a flash of recognition crossing his face before he approached. "You're the guy from the plane," the man said, his voice low but steady. Jim's brow furrowed for a moment, trying to place the man. But then it clicked. The young man, Kyle, who had mocked him on that very flight. The one who had so casually dismissed him. "You've got a good memory," Jim said, his tone dry but not unfriendly. The man, Kyle, hesitated for a moment before sitting down a seat away from Jim. He wasn't looking at him in the same way anymore, that much was clear. The cocky attitude was gone, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. He glanced at Emma, who was now standing nearby, but she didn't seem fazed. She simply nodded, giving them both space to talk. "I just wanted to say," Kyle started, his voice a little rougher than usual. "I owe you an apology for what happened on the plane, for the way I treated you. I didn't really think about it, about who you are, what you've done. I was just being a fool." Jim looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It's all right, kid. No need to apologize. People get caught up in their own stuff. But, yeah, it's appreciated." Kyle seemed to breathe a little easier, the weight of his words having settled between them. There was no grand resolution, no dramatic change in Jim's life. But it was enough. In that brief exchange, Kyle had shown humility, something that Jim hadn't expected. He didn't need to forgive him, not for his own peace. It wasn't about letting go of anger. It was about understanding that people, no matter how different, could change and grow if they were willing to. "I'm glad you're back in here," Kyle said quietly, almost to himself. "And I'll pay for your coffee today, on me." Jim chuckled softly, the sound surprising even him. "That's your way of trying to make up for the meal?" he asked, his voice gentle. Kyle gave him a sheepish smile. "It's the least I can do." Jim raised his mug in a small gesture of acknowledgement. "All right, kid, thanks, but I'll still be back to pay for my own meals next time." Kyle nodded, the earlier tension between them gone. There was an unspoken understanding now, a quiet truce that had formed without the need for grand gestures or words. As Kyle stood to leave, he clapped Jim on the back with an easy grin, the two men sharing a moment of camaraderie that had been earned through mutual respect. As the door closed behind him, Jim took another sip of his coffee, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He glanced up at Emma, who had been watching the exchange with interest. Her smile was just as warm as before, but there was something else in her eyes now, something that felt like recognition, like they had both witnessed something more than just a simple interaction between two people. Jim finished his meal in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of the diner enveloping him. For the first time in a long while, he felt that the world, this small town, was a little more understanding. And as he stood to leave, he realized that maybe the small things, the quiet moments of respect, the small gestures of kindness, were the things that mattered most after all. The following week, Jim returned to the diner again. The quiet routine that had been his for years felt like it was being gently nudged into something new. He'd gone through the motions of his usual life, but now each step seemed to carry a little more weight, a little more significance. The simple act of walking into the diner didn't feel like it used to. It was no longer just a place to sit and eat. It had become a small sanctuary, a place where he could be seen, not just by Emma, but by the world around him. As he entered, the bell above the door chimed, and he immediately spotted Emma behind the counter, as usual. She was humming softly to herself, arranging coffee cups and glancing at the customers. There were a few familiar faces in the diner, a few regulars, but the place felt warmer somehow, more welcoming. It wasn't just the familiar faces, it was the sense of community, of connection, that he had started to realize mattered more than anything else. Emma looked up and smiled when she saw him. It wasn't the polite smile of a waitress greeting another customer, it was something deeper, something more genuine. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice light. "It's good to see you again. The usual?" Jim nodded, settling into his seat at the counter. He had become accustomed to this quiet rhythm now, to the small moments of connection that seemed to surface unexpectedly. There was a comfort in knowing he wasn't invisible, that the past few weeks had shifted something inside him that had been locked away for too long. As Emma prepared his meal, Jim couldn't help but notice the changes around him. It wasn't just the respect from the staff. It wasn't just the way the young people in town had begun to acknowledge him in passing. It was the small things, the nods from the regulars, the soft greetings from people he hadn't noticed before. He was no longer just a fixture in the background. He was part of the fabric of the town again, his presence acknowledged by the people who lived there, even if they didn't fully understand him. Emma placed his coffee down in front of him with a small, knowing smile. "I was thinking about something," she said as she set the mug carefully on the counter. "You know, you've been coming here for a while. I've seen you sit alone, eating your meals, just quietly watching the world go by. But now, it feels different. You seem different." Jim chuckled softly, his fingers brushing against the warm ceramic of the coffee cup. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, genuinely curious. "Don't get me wrong," Emma continued, her voice soft. "You were always respectful, always quiet. But now, I don't know, it's like there's something more there, like you're actually seeing the world around you instead of just sitting in it." Jim paused, the words sinking in. He hadn't expected her to notice that. He hadn't expected anyone to notice. But somewhere along the way, he had started to see things differently. Maybe it was the apology from Kyle. Maybe it was the simple act of kindness that had shifted his own perspective. Whatever it was, it had made him realize that he didn't have to live in the shadows of his past forever. He could still be a part of something, a community, a place, a world that had once felt so far removed from him. "Maybe it's the coffee," Jim said with a wry grin, taking a sip of his drink. But Emma could see the sincerity in his eyes. She knew it wasn't about the coffee. "Well, whatever it is," Emma said, her smile softening, "I'm glad to see it. I know you've been through a lot, and I think that kind of thing should be recognized. Even if you're not looking for it, it's good to be reminded that you matter." Jim didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent so many years avoiding attention, keeping to himself, that it felt strange to hear someone acknowledge him like this. He wasn't looking for validation, but it was different when it came from someone who truly saw him. Not just the veteran, but the person. Emma wasn't offering pity. She wasn't treating him like a charity case. She was treating him like someone who had something to offer, like someone who still had a place in this world. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you." Now, back to the story. The door to the diner opened again, and Jim glanced over to see a familiar face walk in. Kyle, the young man who had apologized to him last week. This time, he wasn't alone. He had brought a friend with him, a woman in her 20s with a bright smile and a friendly demeanor. They made their way to a booth near the window, and Kyle waved to Jim as they passed by. Jim offered a small nod, acknowledging the greeting. Kyle and his friends settled into their booth, talking quietly as they glanced at the menu. Jim's attention lingered on them for a moment. He wasn't sure what had changed in Kyle. Maybe it was the apology, maybe it was something deeper. But the young man seemed to be different now, less self-assured, but in a way that felt like growth. It was hard to explain, but Jim could sense it. "I'm glad he came back," Jim said, surprising himself with the words. "I wasn't expecting him to, but I'm glad he did." Emma nodded, wiping down the counter. "It takes a lot for someone to admit they were wrong," she said, her voice thoughtful, "and even more to actually try to make it right. I think he's on the right path." Jim smiled to himself, feeling a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seemed. People could change, people could grow, and even in the smallest acts, there was a chance to make things better, to bridge the gaps that divided them. For the first time in years, Jim realized that he wasn't alone. Not really. He had Emma, he had the town, and even if the world didn't always understand his past, it wasn't so bad to have his place in it now. As he finished his meal and stood to leave, Kyle caught his eye again, this time with a genuine smile. "Take care, Mr. Carter," he called out. Jim gave him a small nod, his chest swelling with a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. "You too, kid," he said, his voice steady but warm. As Jim walked out of the diner and into the cool night air, he realized that sometimes the smallest changes could make the biggest impact. A kind gesture, an apology, a simple conversation, it all added up. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to find his place again. End of the story.